This presentation is on the origins of food security framings and definitions. The presentation sets out how food security is defined and tracks the evolution of this concept. It suggests that the definition of food security is directly connected to both evolving understandings of the challenges and also wider developmental shifts playing out at a global scale. It should be noted that there is a good deal of criticism levelled at the food security definition. Some argue that it is overly economic and fails to engage the needs of lower-income urban residents whose pursuit of food is not centred exclusively on market-related factors. These criticisms are essential and should be given due attention as they hold merit. While the current food security framing has its limitations, it is used throughout this course, given that it is the concept deemed most credible by most policy and development actors. You may wish to conduct further research and to explore the additional resources offered in this MOOC to acquire a deeper understanding of the contestation surrounding this concept. Part 1 will define food security. Following a spate of famines and hunger challenges in the 1960s and 70s, the United Nations convened the first World Food Conference in 1975. This was a watershed moment as it placed food and food security on the global agenda. Following the deliberations at this conference, the following definition of food security was advanced: the availability at all times of adequate world food supplies of basic foodstuffs to sustain a steady expansion of food consumption and to offset fluctuations in production and prices. This definition centres the availability of food at all times. This highlights the challenges associated with price fluctuations, seasonal variability, and related considerations. It also speaks to the supply of food and basic foodstuffs, which is concerned with sustenance rather than wellness, health, and/or nutrition. It therefore centres basic caloric intake as opposed to the qualitative element thereof. This framing dominates how food security is understood to this day. Many countries argue that they are nationally food secure because they make a caloric provision available to every citizen. However, as we will see in this course, this doesn't quite constitute food security. The concept thus fails to adequately account for policy and development considerations, particularly the right to food and fulfillment of social and economic rights. In 1981, Amartya Sen, the Indian economist whose work seeks to understand the Bengal famine, presented a thesis which noted that during times of famine, plenty of food is surprisingly available. However, this is not equitably distributed, particularly amongst socially vulnerable communities, who are thus disproportionately impacted by starvation. Sen's work, which has been referred to as the entitlements theory, was key to shifting the conceptualization of food security. Consequently, 20 years after the initial FAO definition was posited, a new FAO definition of food security was proposed in 1996. This new definition argues that food security is achieved when, at an individual, household, national, regional, and global level, all people at all times have physical and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that meets their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. This definition fundamentally differs from the earlier one, which prioritized the availability of basic food staples. This definition argues for 4 dimensions of food security, asking if there is enough food available, if people have economic and physical access to obtain that food, in other words, accessibility, if the food is safe and nutritious, in other words, utilization, and if people are able to achieve a healthy and active life at all times, the stability of food availability. In sum, the 4 dimensions emerging from this definition are availability, accessibility, utilization, and stability. In 2001, the FAO again convened and provided further nuance to this definition, stating that food security is a situation that exists when all people at all times have physical, social, and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that meets their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. This definition shifted to mention all people, and in so doing, it subtly included many marginalized groups into the definition, including migrants, informal dwellers, and so forth. The 1975 focus on availability meant that access, utilization, and stability were on a subordinate footing. Therefore, availability was prioritized at the expense of these other conceptual dimensions. Many public officials and development agencies were therefore of the view that an increase in availability translates to an inevitable reduction in the cost of food. This mistakenly presumed to enable greater access and, as a result, facilitate increased utilization, ensuring greater stability of food availability. This view continues to predominate even to today. From 1975 until 2020, the view remained dominant, influencing the direction of academic research, public discourse, and approaches to food security policies, as well as how national governments engaged with these. The position has since been critiqued, however. Within the UN system, the High-Level Panel of Experts, or the HLPE, which is mandated to reflect on and consider the food system, has provided definitional clarity on food and its related concepts. Following the emergence of the Sustainable Development Goals and the New Urban Agenda, as well as other global processes relating to equity and climate, it was deemed necessary to provide a more expansive definition of food security. In 2020, the High-Level Panel of Experts proposed a definition which frames food security as a situation that exists when all people at all times have physical, social, economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious foods that meets their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. You will note that there is no departure from the 2001 definition. However, in this framing, the HLPE stressed the need to consider the dimensions of food security differently. All people at all times having physical, social, and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food means a measure of agency, the ability to choose and make decisions, not necessarily informed by what donor agencies provide, but on the basis of what food security means personally. Hence, agency is acknowledged. Much of the engagement on the stability dimension was critiqued for adopting a short-termist view on food security. Given the ecological stresses and greenhouse gas emissions associated with agriculture and the food system, it was recognized that it is essential to incorporate the dimension of sustainability. Therefore, the dimension of sustainability, looking at stability over the longer term, was added. These dimensions, now expanded from 4 to 6, namely availability, accessibility, utilization, stability, agency, and sustainability, means that the previously hierarchical conceptualization of food security needed to be discarded. It is important to note that these 6 dimensions of food security are to be viewed as interrelated, interconnected, and mutually reinforcing. No longer can it be argued that because we have enough food available, therefore the other dimensions need not be prioritized. Each dimension is equally important and thus holds the same weight in food security decisions and actions. However, this has created some interesting discussions and challenges, notably the measurement of said dimensions. For example, how is agency to be measured? Similarly, how should we define and frame agency? Sustainability itself is a contested term, Therefore, there remains a great deal of research and conceptualization that needs to be undertaken by food scholars. It is clear, however, that the definition of insecurity has become more robust as it has evolved over time. We are currently in a period of flux, since it has only been a few years since the definition and additional dimensions were proposed. The revised definition and dimensions thus remain to be tested and operationalized, and this presents interesting challenges and tensions, particularly at the urban scale. Finally, it's worth noting that what happens in food security and how it is defined is not isolated to the food system alone. A historical reflection where we engage on the origins of the definitions of food security and other global processes, from global geopolitics, pop culture, development discourses, urban transitions, and even discursive shifts, all intersect and influence how we conceptualize, understand, prioritize, and engage in food security.